This one sent to CornyDriveThru at gmail.com from John Fell in Baltimore.
Oh, a returning OG to the program. John Fell in Baltimore. And, of course, that made all the local news. He's up now, and he's asked a question.
I understand David Simon's making an HBO series about his fall in Baltimore, but let's get to this question here. In the territory days, with dirty canvases and constant travel, how did wrestlers avoid getting infections in their heads or arms when they cut there? Other than butterfly bandages and Band-Aids, was there ever a need to use an antibiotic cream on a deep cut? With a person who bled easy, was there ever an issue of wounds opening up in the middle of the night while sleeping? Flair has said he bled almost every night during the 1986 Great American Bash. It's crazy to think you guys had to get juiced 4 to 6 times a week and still be able to wrestle every night with those cuts happening so often and not constantly bleed.
Well, where can I start tackling this? For one thing, the dirty mats and the Zabada, the germs. Everybody had tubes of Neosporin in their bag, and you didn't just slap the piece of tape on it. Usually, you would put a little Neosporin or something. Well, some guys would, some guys wouldn't. I mean, I don't know if Abby was a big Neosporin person because, it was so often and so much. But Flair and Garvin, when they had that series, they both had, especially Flair, he was putting it on every night because Ronnie's overhand chops, for some reason, took more skin off than Flair's knife edge chops. But when Garvin and Flair worked that program where they were working every night of the week for weeks on end, Flair lost, it was like he looked like a burn victim because the top 2 layers of the epidermis, right, the skin, was all peeled off of his chest, and it was the pinker, brighter skin underneath it, like when a burn victim's blister falls off. So he was covering his chest every night with that fucking antibiotic cream. Dennis Condrey used to save his blades because it's time consuming to make one. And sometimes you don't have enough tape or you don't have a blade or you don't have the right scissors or whatever. Dennis would save his in one of those little pill containers. Like your pill strip for Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday.
Right.
He'd have a couple of, after he used them, he'd put them back in his tights. And when he got back in the locker room, he'd pull it out, he'd soak it in some alcohol, and he'd put it back in the fucking container, and he'd use it the next time he needed one. Saved making another one. Probably not the most hygienic thing, but it was only him. He mentioned cutting, and nobody was cutting their arm back then except for the Sheik. And
Dusty.
Well, and Dusty did. Dusty did it. Actually, Dusty started doing it in Detroit, didn't he? When he worked for the Sheik up there.
Oh, maybe. I don't know.
Because that famous picture of him with the U.S. title, his arm is bleeding, is from Detroit. But anyway, there was very few people doing that. The mats were disgusting. In the Sportatorium in Dallas, you could smell the mildew from the ring because the ring was never taken down in that building. And I don't know how often the mat may have ever been changed, but the padding underneath and everything peripherally around the ring was still the same as it had been for years and years. You could smell the mildew 20 feet away. In Tennessee, the Memphis territory, old canvases that were duct taped and had been sewed up or patched or not even patched, especially on the spot show ring that they used to carry around on an open trailer, not a truck, but an open trailer down the interstate. And so in the summertime, they've gone through these county fair shows in the backwoods of nowhere. Those rings are filthy. You just did the best you could, but with the specifically, and sometimes you got busted open or got scraped, and that's why staph infections would come from elbow and knee scrapes and things like that, because that's something you didn't think about paying a lot of attention to. You got those all the time. You're paying attention to cut on your head or whatever, but So it was not. And then there was, staph just is transmitted by potentially sometimes somebody's sweat getting in the wrong place.
It seems like we heard a lot about staph infections in the last 15 or 20 years. Do you hear a lot about it back then before wrestling fans knew about what injuries were?
Oh, yeah, because that's the worst thing. Staph is not only painful and deadly if it's untreated because it's blood poisoning, but also it's contagious. And so and it comes from the dirt and the grime and the et cetera, getting into an open wound or whatever. So that was the thing that you were worried about. One of the things you were most worried about was you don't want to get a staph infection. You got to take off work. You may have to have antibiotics, something lanced. It's a process. And a lot of guys had trouble with it. And then back in the 20s and 30s, was it trachoma that Strangler Lewis had that caused guys to go blind? It was a disease of the eyes that you got from dirty mats and sweat and germs or whatever. And I guess there's treatments for it now, but it caused blindness in those days. And there was Fez talks about it in his book. There was some treatment that they gave back then where they actually had to take some type of pumice stone and scrape your eyeball. And
oh my God.
Yeah, I don't want to be doing that.
No.
So
all right.
But
so
now
first
but
aid
now
in the territories.
Everything is as clean as a fucking whistle, and there's no grease, grit, grime, or glamour or anything. And it's kind of like, that's when they cleaned wrestling, they took the heart out of it. Now the ring is clean, the seats are clean, the building's clean, the lights are bright. Nobody's allowed to hurt each other in a working way just for real by accident. And it was a lot grittier back then.